All right. So today I have the pleasure of being joined by Joe Bryan on the show. Joe, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Oh, my pleasure, Stefan. Thanks for the invite.
Of course. So as I was doing research for this podcast, an interesting thing that stood out to me about your background is your major in physics. And correct me if, of course, if I'm wrong with any of this, but you studied physics at Oxford University, and I think that's a unique major. Let's say I don't think I've talked to any physics majors yet on the show, and so the first question that I'd love to start off with, because I think it's also relevant to where we'll get down later in the line, is kind of how you view from a physics background the relationship between energy and money.
Oh, nice. Um, well, energy is the one thing you can't fake, and that's a critical. That's exactly what you need in your money. So, perfect money is energy bound by the real world, and we've had proxies to that in the past. And gold was the most efficient energy money we had until the discovery of Bitcoin, and ultimately that's why gold, alongside its monetary properties, which it's sufficiently good on the range of properties you need in a money.
Mhm.
The combination of those two things led to gold being the hardest money in the world. But then Bitcoin is the culmination of the evolution of money, in that it's absolutely bounded by energy. It's 100% efficiently bounded by energy. And it's perfect across the characteristics of a monetary system you would need. So it's the solution for money. And so yeah, there's no separating the energy from the money.
Yeah. No, agreed. And I think, I know we just kind of jumped into it with a bit of a technical question, but I think it's interesting because I think not a lot of people necessarily maybe make the relationship with energy and money, right? Because I think a lot of times, at least my generation and a lot of people don't maybe associate the relationship of money with energy. I mean, obviously we expend energy to earn money, but I think the fact of having actual money, so in the case US dollar or euro, be tied to energy, I think is very important. And as you mentioned there, we had it a bit with gold, where you have to mine gold, you have to expend energy to be able to, create gold and produce gold. And similarly with Bitcoin, right? You have to mine Bitcoin in order and use real world energy in order to create Bitcoin. And I think, the point that I want to discuss with you is, and I guess maybe we'll first because similarly, and we'll get into your video in a bit also, but I think what I like a lot about your work and the way you approach things is also describing the problem before kind of getting to the solution, right? And so why is it a problem in this world that right now, the way fiat currencies are constructed, they're not bound by energy and they can be, kind of just created at will?
Well, I mean, at a very fundamental level, it's as you just mentioned, like you expend your real world energy in exchange for something, right? And it's not quite like chemical energy becomes electrical energy. It's not the conservation of energy in a sort of a physical sense, because of course, like, you could expend energy digging a hole and then filling it back in again. That is not valuable. That is not valuable work. So energy by itself, expenditure of energy, does not equal value.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But it's more the representation of your economic energy, your contribution to other people in some form where they recognize the value you have contributed to them. I mean, that could be, having a decade's worth of prior learning to know how to go into a machine and turn one screw,
Yeah.
right? And that's extremely valuable because you'd have to know which screw to turn once, right? And then the machine starts working again. That may be 5 seconds of work, but it's 10 years of learning, right? And so it's not about the physical expenditure of energy at any particular moment. It's your economic contribution to society, right? Which you are then conserving in a monetary form which doesn't decay. Now, if you're converting your economic energy into something that is not bounded explicitly by energy in the real world, you're being stolen from,
Mm-hmm.
because you're swapping your optimal output for something that's corrupted, that someone else can replicate for free. And they didn't require an optimal output of their own economic energy to produce it. They just hit a button on a keyboard, and they produced exactly the same outcome that you did. That is theft.
Yeah.
That is theft of your life. That's theft of your. It is theft of your life, right? They've devalued your contribution, and you had no choice in it, which is just fundamentally wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I fully agree with that, and I think that's a really clear and simplistic way of outlining it. But how did we get here? Like how? Because I mean,
I
that's a
mean, in
very
this conversation, or
complicated.
just generally.
No, that's a very complicated and loaded question. I know, but I think um, because I think it's the awareness part, right? That's important because I think a lot of people, unless you're living through, maybe hyperinflationary currencies, like I was just actually in Argentina, and there it's crazy how you notice the effects of living through, essentially hyperinflation there. But unless, you're living through one of those currencies, I think people like in the US and Europe, maybe more nowadays, are waking up to what's happening. But I think a lot of people still genuinely, lack the awareness of or maybe the know-withal to know what to do with the information of like, how did we get to a point where, I have to earn money and I have to expend my energy doing a craft through a job, whatever, to then have it essentially, be debased. And like you said, someone can just click a button and, and print something that you have to expend energy for. Like, why, how is that even possible?
It's like the boiling frog on a number of different dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back far enough, when people were using gold to exchange value for one another, the gold, whilst not perfect money, like you couldn't transport it easily, you couldn't really tell necessarily whether a gold coin was real or not,
Mm-hmm.
right? At least it broadly represented something that couldn't be faked. Couldn't be faked instantly and without a lot of effort.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And it couldn't be faked because somebody had to dig it out the ground. Someone had to then process it, like refine the metal, turn it into coins and bring it into circulation. They can still create it, right? There is still a link to energy, but the only people who can create it are the ones that own the gold mines. It's not open to everybody, right? But it's still bounded by energy in some form. But then, clearly we don't use gold today. So that was the best monetary system we had until people wanted to solve for the inefficiencies in that monetary system.
Mm.
Like if you're trying to pay someone 100 miles away in gold, you don't want to be taking gold bags, 100 miles on a horse and cart and stuff like that. So eventually you end up putting almost like an accounting layer on top of the money. So people put the gold coins in the bank looks after that, keeps them safe and tells them how much they have, gives them a letter of credit or a receipt to say this is good for 100 gold coins or whatever. And then you end up trading with the paper because it's just easier.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's easier. And then you have the telegraph, and then you can do that over the wires. You don't have to actually physically take the paper. And then the gold ends up just never moving. It just stays in the same place, and people swap the rights to the gold, not the gold itself. And then eventually you have the wars, and there's more and more centralization of the gold supply, because once you can issue paper representing gold, you can just issue more paper than you have gold, right? And so the banks start making loans, right? The banks loan more paper than they have gold, and that paper circulates, and that's fine until someone comes and asks for their gold back. But then when things inevitably turn, because they've inflated the economy by printing money. Right? You have this asset bubble that goes up. Suddenly something happens, whatever it may be, turns sentiment. Suddenly people start to get worried, start selling the assets, recalling loans, and they realize there's not enough gold. And so everyone rushes to get their gold out, and the bank says, sorry, we haven't got enough gold for the paper. And people go bust, the bank goes bust, and then inevitably you get greater levels of centralization appear. So all these regional and township banks that have done this get rolled up into like state banks, get rolled up into a central bank. And the central bank will then have a national currency rather than different bits of paper from any individual state bank, etc. And then you end up with a centralized currency across a country where all the gold just sits in the vault, and the currency of the country is meant to be linked to gold. But then the same thing happens again. It's like no one ever gets the gold. And so you just print more money, especially when you have a government that can control it. And so same thing happens. Eventually people say, well, hang on, where's all this paper come from? Can I have the gold? And then some point they go, no. And they just sever the link. They sever link completely. And so now everybody uses paper in a system where it's not linked to gold at all. It is just paper. In which case there's no link to energy anymore. There's nothing stopping the person with the big red button that could just press the big red button and make more money through paper, because there's no physical real world constraint of any sort under the bonnet. It's just monopoly money. But then all the countries have their own monopoly money, and they all print it or grow the balance sheet at a similar rate to one another. So all the currency pairs look relatively stable versus one another. They're all just getting destroyed, though, versus the actual purchasing power of things that exist in the real world that are connected to energy. This is why gold just goes up forever. Right? And gold goes up forever in price, even though they're producing another 2% a year forever.
Yeah.
Like, we've got almost unlimited amount of gold in the world. It's just buried. Right? It's there, it's just buried. But there becomes a point where the price goes up enough, it becomes economical to expend more resources by paying in paper to dig the previously uneconomical gold out of the ground.
Yeah.
Right? And so the supply of gold will go up forever. And yet the price of gold is going up forever. The supply of gold doubles every 30 years, 30, 40 years. But the price has gone up like 100-fold, maybe in a couple of 100 years. And I'm ballparking this.
Yeah.
But if your currency was stable, if your money was stable, the gold price shouldn't really be moving when measured in it. But your gold supply has gone up multiples, and at the same time gone up like 100x in the price of the when measured in your local currency. It tells you your money's broken. It's because it's not bounded by energy. So that's how we got there. It's like the boiling frog, like small changes over a period of time, where people lose the intuitive sense that their day-to-day money needs to be bounded by energy. Right. And that happens gradually, but it always ends the same way. Total destruction of the purchasing power of the paper money.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have a big red button, you use it.
Yeah.
This is not a new thing. Not a new thing in the world.
No, it's not, and I think, I mean, your video, of course, and I'm going to link it in the show notes, and I recommend my listeners really. It's I mean, you've gotten a lot of praise for it, because I think it is one of the easiest to understand and most approachable ways to understanding Bitcoin, and it's also because, as the name of the video implies, what's the problem? You talk about the problem before talking about the solution. And I think this is important also for people to understand Bitcoin, because you can't really understand Bitcoin without understanding what it solves. And like we talked about a bit earlier, I think a lot of people in other countries, I've also had people on the show from, for example, Venezuela, from hyper countries where they're experiencing either extremely high or even hyperinflation, and those people understand that you can't save your money in a currency, because it becomes essentially worthless. And I think now more and more we're starting to notice that also in the US and in Europe, of course. So how do you see kind of like the current state of affairs, if you will, with regards to where we are in this I don't know if I want to call it a game, but is in this development of fiat currencies. Where do you see the current state of things?
Yeah, we're not in a good place, but it's all relative. It's all relative, Stefan. Like if you've had people from Venezuela, Argentina, they're in a terrible place. But all these things ain't end the same way. It's structurally no different whatsoever. It's just decaying faster. It's just about speed. I mean, if you took the charts of of the Venezuelan, I don't know what the Venezuelan currency is. I mean, it changes all the time, right? But yeah, and you compared that with the purchasing power of the dollar or the euro or the pound. If you zoom out enough, it's the same chart. It's the same chart. The time scale is different. You know, in the fullness of time, the purchasing power goes to zero of all of these currencies. Now, with the Venezuelan currency, that might take 10 years. And when I say goes to zero, it like trends to zero.
Yeah.
You can lose 10% a year in purchasing power forever without reaching zero. It's effectively close to zero and eventually will hit zero when the powers that be give up on that currency because the public have lost faith in the currency. And you see this countless times throughout history. You know, a weak currency gets replaced with a brand new, newly named currency in the same country, different notes, different face on them, same game. And then that goes to zero. It's the same everywhere. No fiat currency is any different. The only difference is the timescales, and the timescales are impacted by the credibility of the governments involved, and often that's through power, might, military strength, level of regulatory robustness, and rule of law.
Yeah.
You know, when you're in a country where you have a weak rule of law, it's a lot easier to press the big red button and not only demolish the currency in the interest of the nation, but also demolish the currency by stealing it outright, right? And siphoning it into hard assets in different countries and then absconding, which is, dictator playbook 101. We tend not to have that in the West. I mean, we certainly have. I mean, I won't comment on the criminality that we do see in our own countries at certain levels, but we all know it's there. It's just not quite as it's disguised as being legitimate in some way through lobbying and things like that, right? But you don't get it on the scale where it destroys the entire country. What you tend to have is that the central bank stacks the deck in such a way that, I mean, for example, the mandate of central banks is inflation and price stability. Stable inflation, price stability, and increasingly like a full job market. I don't know. They keep changing the mandates. They can add them on over time. But when you target a positive inflation rate as your baseline, you're telling people what's about to happen. So if every central bank in the world targets 2% inflation, and they justify the 2% inflation because, well, two reasons. A, well, all the other banks target 2% inflation. Right, well, that can't be the reason that you all do 2% because it's got to start somewhere, right? But it's also because they've embraced an economic framework that says inflation is required. It is required for a healthy economy. So based on those two things, if they then steal 2% a year from you forever, they're stealing half of your purchasing power over, I don't know, 50 years, 20 years, 30 years. Right? And the real inflation rate is not 2% anyway, and we all know that. It's, they'll say we're targeting 2. It's actually 3 when we measure it. Reality, it's 10.
Yeah.
Right? And that doesn't include the hidden inflation that we see through like corrosion of quality and shrinkflation and all of these other things. So like it's probably somewhere 10 to 20% a year. This is why people are starting, like society's cracking at the edges. Is that people feel like they visibly look at their quality of life now versus 2 years ago or 5 years ago, and it's noticeably different.
Yeah.
Right? 2% is not noticeable, but when you tell them it's 2%, and it's actually 20%, that's noticeable. Right? But then, if you are doing that through a governance framework and a legal framework and a economic education framework that is strong and has hundreds of years of, history behind it, it gives you that air of legitimacy, right? As opposed to a tin pot dictator who's took power in a coup 5 years ago, and there's like no legal framework there. There's no economic rationale there. There's no stable education system there. It's just we're operating against in a framework that is just a lie.
Yeah.
It's just a lie. Like, we don't need inflation. If you embrace an economic framework in the West to say we need inflation because you want to be able to press the big red button. If you say we need inflation, it means that you can hit the big red button and print loads of money. Of course you would do that. If you were in charge of the big red button, of course you would tell everyone we need to press it. Or, you certainly wouldn't tell them about the dangers of pressing it. And it's only when you approach this from a, first principles, like how should the world actually work when you leave people alone, you realize like how just ludicrous the current system is. And then it's like, okay, well, it makes no sense at all. And then Bitcoin is very much becomes the very clear answer to that, because no one has a big red button.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a very long answer to
No,
your.
but I really enjoyed listening to that because I think, you have a really good way of explaining because it is a lot of times complicated topics, especially also because people are taught to believe a certain way, right? Like when a government tells you, oh yeah, we're targeting 2% inflation, not everybody has an economics background. Not everybody's going to study, central banking or things like that. So, it's you're taught to believe that inflation is good, and it's essentially like you said, it's basically legalized theft, right? When you're saying, okay, we're targeting 2% every year, you're saying like we are going to essentially steal 2% a year, but we all know it's much more than that. And I think it has a lot of effects on society, as you said. People's quality of lives are deteriorating because the currency that they are saving in is losing value day and night. One thing
I mean, on that point, Stephan, right? Just a simple thought experiment. If I gave you money now and it loses 2% a year, you don't necessarily feel under a massive amount of pressure to make a decision about that money. If it loses 2% a month, you feel a bit more pressure. 2% a week, 2% a day, 2% an hour, 2% a minute. What's the change like in your decision making and the quality of your decision making and the time frame against which you're focused in your life? They all get massively corrupted, increasingly corrupted.
Yeah.
Right. And so you run that the other way and say, okay, imagine if it was 2% a decade. There's 2% every 100. Imagine it was 0. Imagine it went up. Right, gradually. What does that then mean about the way you think about the world? And the decision-making process that you have? You're not under pressure. Like you're not forced to do something so you don't lose it. Like this is that little example there is hopefully will help people just realize like how corrosive this thing is. You don't think about 10 years time when your money's melting every day. You don't, because you think about this week or next week. I mean, it's just so obvious. It's like, why do we live in a society that's so short-termist? Why do people not feel like they've got a stake in the game for the long run in society, especially the younger generations? It's because the money's broken.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really true, and I think it's a really good thought experiment for people to have, because I think money is essentially the foundation of cooperation in society, right? If the money is broken, people, as you mentioned, they're living for today. They're not thinking about the future. They're maybe more impulsive with their actions, aggression. I saw this also. Argentina was one of the first times that I went to a country and I visibly felt the effects of a country that has a broken money. It feels less safe. People are, generally like there's a lot more crime. There's a lot of corruption. You're feeling this, and this is not just the money, it's also the political infrastructure there, of course. But, you kind of notice that when the money is broken, when the foundational layer of cooperation and communication is broken, everything else kind of deteriorates from there, right? And I think, that's why also your example in the story and everything highlights also why the problem is so important to understand, because I do still think that a lot of people don't fundamentally understand the problem.
Yeah, absolutely right. But they don't understand it, but they know it intuitively it's true.
Yeah.
They know intuitively it's there. They know something's wrong. They can't explain it, but they know something's wrong. And they know the decisions in their lives are being driven by something they're not fully aware of.
Mm.
And once you join the dots to them, it becomes very clear around that the whole decision making is downstream of the money being broken. The choice of, where to live, when to get married, whether to get married, whether to have children, all of this is the money. It's the
Yeah.
money.
Yeah, and I think also another interesting thing that you mentioned on, right, when you were doing the thought experiment, it's like, imagine if if inflation was zero, or imagine if even, the purchasing power of the money that you had increased over time. And I think that's a ludicrous thing for people to even imagine, because it's like, oh, I'm just going to put my money on a bank and it's going to increase in purchasing power. That makes no sense. But then I also really like, Jeff Booth's book, The Price of Tomorrow. And it's then when you start to think about like, okay, but as a society, we're getting more productive, right? We have technology that's making our lives immensely more productive, especially now also with AI and everything that's coming out. So we should typically be working less and things should be cheaper, but it's not. And it's not because we're not more productive or, we're not more efficient as a society. It's again, because that base layer is broken and governments keep pressing that big red button, which devalues, everything you own, and also forces you to become a speculator and forces you to invest in things that maybe you don't have a lot of knowledge about. And these all these cascading effects that I think, yeah, it's really sad when when you think about it.
It is, and people haven't read The Price of Tomorrow. It's definitely encourage them to order that book and read it. It's a fantastic book. Um, and but in the video, there's one slide in the video where they're on the island, Stephan, which is ins- it's just Jeff's book in one slide, like a poor man's attempt to summarize a book in 60 seconds. But it gets the general idea across. And when you hear that for 60 seconds, it's then very clear why, when you have good money, when you have perfect money and a free market, that prices should be going down over time. Prices going down over time means your money is more valuable, right? Which is exactly the thought experiment we had. Like that's just what happens when you have perfect money and you leave people alone.
Yeah.
Because people are productive and they compete with one another. And when you remove the rules and regulations and you don't give people undue protection in an economy, if they're charging too much or their quality is too poor for their price, they get outcompeted.
Mm-hmm.
They go out of business. Right? And we all know that's that's true. We know that's true.
Yeah.
And so just play that out. What happens is prices go down and quality goes up over time. That's it. So what does that mean? Well, it means the money's becoming more valuable. Like, this is just so obvious. Like, once you think about it, it's just so obvious. But then how did the world end up the way it ended up? It's
Yeah.
because you print money. And the more money you print, it's not you're just debasing the purchasing power of each individual bit of money. You're corrupting the free market as well. Because the way you produce the money is centralized. And so the people closer to the money printer, closer to the big red button, get the money first. They become more profitable. And they attract people from the rest of the economy closer to the big red button, which reduces the productivity and the competition
Mm-hmm.
and innovation in the rest of the economy, and brings it closer to the government, which stops prices going down, right? And then drives prices up because more new fresh money is sweeping across the rest of the economy because it's been printed for free. So it's like this dual aspect
Yeah.
problem, like a double impact. It reduce the productivity and at the same time print a load of money and make the prices go up. So you stop them falling and you've made them go up, so they just go up even more.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's the money, but also because you end up printing the money centrally, the government becomes bigger and bigger and bigger over time because there's never a constraint now on government spending. There's never any compromises that really have to be made because you just kick the can down the road, issue more debt, print more money, whatever. The government becomes bigger and bigger and bigger and now has to get involved in more and more of society to try and compensate for the problems it's created because it's been printing the money.
Yeah.
So it prints more money and then creates more rules and regulations across the rest of society, which further inhibits the free market everywhere. So now it starts to protect certain sectors, certain industries, certain ways of doing business from competition.
Mm.
So now prices definitely start going up and quality starts going down because you can't compete with them anymore because they're protected. Because they're regulated or they're protected industries. I mean, it's all just the big red button. They take away the big red button, this disappears.
Yeah.
Right. And when you're thinking about Bitcoin as well, in the scenario we've just been describing, someone's hitting the big red button, they're printing their own currency. Right. In order to exchange that currency, you really need to be within their legal boundary
Mm-hmm.
in that country. It may be acceptable outside the country, but in that country. Whereas with Bitcoin, it doesn't matter. I could trade with anybody anywhere in the world. The concept of a legal boundary doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah.
You can't stop the Bitcoin flowing from A to B, from anyone to anyone. And so the Bitcoin is the unleashing of the global free market. Right?
Yeah.
So it's not just the antidote to money, right? It's the characteristics of Bitcoin. Just demolish everything. Like it frees everybody, regardless of where you are.
Yeah. And I think that's a super important concept also for people to understand, because it's not just the decentralization of the control of the money printer, let's say, right? Bitcoin has no centralized control. There's a scheduled supply, that will be, the X amount of Bitcoin will be released into the world in X amount of time. And there's nobody that can control that amount, no matter how hard they try. And I think that's an important thing to understand, but also the other thing, like you said, is right. There's no geographical constrictions. I think the world that's also going to open up in terms of innovation, where I can send money from, someone here in Spain to someone in Africa in a second, without any intermediaries, without anybody telling me I can and cannot do it. And I think that's, incredibly powerful. And I think the amount of human capital that I think is also going to be unlocked because of the previous constraints that were there, I think is also going to be yeah, an incredible byproduct of Bitcoin.
Yeah, well, it's very hard to subjugate entire populations,
Mm,
right, through a fragmented monetary system enforced by violence
yeah.
when they can just use money, the same money as the rest of the world without constraint,
Mm,
right? And so think about all the latent productivity that we have locked away in countries around the world because of the behavior of their governments and central banks and international boundaries. I mean, it's going to be staggering, absolutely staggering, right? We have the same people in America as we do in Ghana, as we do in South Korea, as we do in, I don't know, Bolivia. Same people, right? Same characteristics, same level of ingenuity. It's the situation they find themselves in, which is different,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, and I think yeah, another incredible byproduct of Bitcoin is the ability to open those markets. And I think, kind of given the world that we're in today, with as you were discussing earlier, these centralizing forces, that there's countries that seem to take on more control, and I think also technology is amazing, but is also in a way gives them more power to take control. We're seeing now also in the UK, like a push for a digital ID and things like that. And we're seeing, places like China that's already basically a surveillance state because of technology. How do you see that moving forward, and how do you see kind of the interplay of these centralizing forces that want to take more and more control versus the decentralizing forces like Bitcoin and other freedom technology that are going to kind of clash?
Well, it's because the money's broken,
Mm,
right? Because the money is broken, we go through that spiral effect of bigger and bigger government undermining society in all these different ways, greater and greater levels of instability, political fragmentation, political extremism, the greater and greater levels of demanded transparency or a total erosion of privacy with regards for the individual from the state, because the state is insolvent.
mm,
And when the state's insolvent, it goes back to the population. I say insolvent, I use insolvent very loosely because they have a big red button. They can just print as much money as they want. Insolvent unless they press the big red button, because all their debts are in nominal amounts. They owe 100, say they owe £1 billion.
mhm,
It doesn't mean £1 billion of the purchasing power as of today. It's just £1 billion. So you just go and print £1 billion and give you £1 billion. It's now worth less, obviously,
mm,
right? So they're insolvent if you thought about the real world energy required to settle their bills, but not when they can just print it forever for free. But we're still in this sort of make believe world where people think about budgets and they try and balance the books, but no politician is inclined to ever balance the books because their time frame is 4 years or 8 years, not 100 years,
yeah.
not 50. It's not a lifetime for the population. And so this is why we just always run structural deficits everywhere, more and more debt, because no one can ever take the medicine. Economies, you're never allowed to have a downturn. You're never allowed to see the asset prices fall more than a little bit because before the banking sector starts screaming and they print more money and there's bailouts and all these things. It's because the money's broken. Because the money's broken, and it's inexorably leads you to the state wanting more and more information from you in case you're not paying your fair share into the big black hole, right? And there's no, when this has happened in the past, before we had the internet, before we had technology, the state was at the way the state could enforce that was like through physicality. They could come and knock on your door, you know, turn your house upside down looking for whatever, right? But now our lives are online, our assets are increasingly online. Our communications are largely online. But it means that the state can then also use those routes to reach everywhere and anywhere with no physical effort. And so, it's just a constant battle of being able to maintain a level of privacy that you shouldn't have to fight for. Just because you're private doesn't mean you're hiding anything. And they'll offer you, well, if you've got nothing to hide, why wouldn't you? It's like, well, okay, why do you have curtains?
Mm.
You got nothing to hide. Like, you don't have curtains.
Yeah.
If you got nothing to hide, how about you make your email account access, put the password on the government website. Let us all read your emails. Let's see all your bank statements. Privacy does not mean that you've done something wrong. It's just things can be private. You don't want to share it with other people. But the government, when it's in its death throes, or like when a currency is, when a money is in its death throes, and this can be prolonged for a long period of time, the state is just going to come more and more for greater level of control, greater level of centralization, and that's what we see. And there's no surprise that there is a massive overlap in the timing of the push for digital IDs across all these different countries, all at the same time. It's very clearly orchestrated, but it's not about. And in different countries, they use different rationale for it.
Yeah.
One country it'll be about controlling immigration. It makes no difference whatsoever. We already have national insurance cards. You're not supposed to employ someone in the UK unless they have a national insurance number. So introducing some other number they have to have makes no difference because the current system doesn't work, if you're saying that's the problem. So there's some fabrication as to why we need this, and it depends on what's relevant for the country. But all it is about unlocking central bank digital currencies. So it's like the final weaponization of the money. Mm-hmm. It's like to think that we have a money right now that is being printed and that is being corrupted. You've not seen anything yet. Like if they bring in digital IDs, that creates a digital version of you, which is linked to everything, which is linked to your bank accounts, all of these things. It then allows them to bring in central bank digital currencies, which is to make the money programmable. And so you think we have digital money now because it's like numbers on a screen. No. You still require the bank's permission to do something. You require the government's permission to move money, etc., etc. But the money itself doesn't change by itself. Yeah. The money itself doesn't expire. The money itself can be used to buy things as long as the bank allows you to send it. Right? In a future world, the money's going to expire. The money is only going to be spendable on some things, not spendable on other things. It's going to be linked to your social score. It's who did you vote for in the last election? Have you joined a demonstration about something? Or have you posted something on X that somebody somewhere didn't like? Right? Your money's now frozen. Like all of this is like tyranny in a box. Mm. Right? So if we allow digital identity to come into existence in the West, like you're one step away from being game over from any sort of level of privacy or ability to control your own assets. And I'd say the ability to control your own assets is already massively compromised because you require permission for everything. The only thing you don't require permission for is Bitcoin. Right? No one can stop you. And so, anyone listening who's been on the fence about this Bitcoin thing should definitely spend some time learning about it, because you want to learn about it before you need it.
Yeah.
And everyone's going to need it.
Yeah, just got chills because it's so true, but I think, and so important for people to understand, because I think, as you mentioned, it's not just the money, but I think it's just a centralizing force of people are being more and more restricted into what they can and cannot do, and being monitored and censored. And Bitcoin, I don't know what we'd do if we didn't have Bitcoin, because for me, Bitcoin, is hope, because I think it's the one concrete solid solution out of this that allows you, to take your energy, to take your assets and put it into something that, obviously there's a whole self-custody talk and everything as well that you can control that is outside of the reach of the state or anything. And I think, as you mentioned, it's important for people to learn about it and understand how to use it before it's too late and before maybe some of the gates are closed and it becomes a lot more difficult, not just to acquire Bitcoin, but also to send it to a self-custody wallet. And thankfully, Bitcoin is a global phenomenon. Thankfully, it's not restricted to one state or one country. So it's like the internet, right? It's very difficult to prohibit. But I think that's why also your work is so important, because I think it starts at the basis, right, of like understanding what's the problem. And I think once people understand that, I think they can go deeper and start to understand, okay, now how do I get some? Now what do I do with it? Do I keep it on exchange? Do I move it off? All those things. But yeah, it's I think right now the most important thing anybody can do is learn about Bitcoin and understand how to use it.
Yeah. There's very few things in life you should be prioritizing over learning about Bitcoin.
Yeah, agreed. And I know we're running short on time here. So the last question I want to ask you, that I ask at the end of every show, given kind of what we just talked about and the fact that there are a lot of new people entering the space, hopefully more and more and more and more. What advice would you have to anybody entering? Because I know it can be overwhelming. I know there's a lot of information out there, but if you for giving them one-on-one advice, what would you tell anybody coming into the space?
Bitcoin is not Bitcoin unless you hold it yourself.
Agreed. Yeah. It's very important that's a very important point, because I think now, we have exchanges and ways of owning Bitcoin and even ETFs that make it seem like you own Bitcoin. But I think the importance of self-custody cannot be understated, given everything we just talked about as well. So, so that's a very good point you mentioned there. So, but yeah, that being said, I'll be sure again. We've talked about it a few times. We've covered some of the fundamental concepts in the show, but I didn't want to go through everything because I think people need to spend the time to go through the whole video, because it's the most valuable, I think, for beginners, the most valuable video there is on understanding why Bitcoin is important and what the problem is. So I'll link that in the show notes. But anything else you want to guide my listeners to, or where can they find you, or anything more about what you're working on?
Well, thank you, Stephan. I love everyone to watch the video. And I mean, you can just Google what's the problem and it will be there. But if you go to what'stheproblem.org, that's where you'll find the video, but also some follow-on resources. Some extra videos covering different introductory aspects of Bitcoin, from the technology to the humanitarian aspects to the business benefits, how the monetary system in general works, all very accessible intro level, and a bunch of books as well to get you started. It can seem like a big, unapproachable topic because it's technology and it's money and it's out of the comfort zone for a lot of people. But just start learning, start listening to podcasts. It will take a while for probably the penny to drop, but as you said, Bitcoin is hope. Bitcoin is hope for everyone. And if we didn't have it, things would be very bleak right now.
Yeah, agreed. I think Bitcoin is hope, and that's a great way to end it. Joe, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed it. I know my listeners will as well. And thanks also for all you're doing in the space.
Oh, well, I've really enjoyed it too, Stephan. So thank you.
Thank you.